Chapter 9. New Friends. Now began a series of domestic posts, beginning by becoming Haustochter to Dr. Lang, a GP in Dresden. It was while she worked for him that she became involved with an association of Christian Jews, and first met the young law student Hans Werner Kastner, who was to figure so prominently in all our lives. All my life, even when I was a very young child, I knew about this friend of my mother's from Germany, who then lived in London. I suppose I first really became aware of him when I started to read and write. My mother would occasionally get long letters from him in German, and some of her excitement at receiving them must have insinuated itself into my subconscious. The name Hans Werner, or H.W., or as she called him in the strong German accent she was never to lose, H.W., was synonymous with someone intellectual and cultured, someone who knew about books, theatre, music, someone who was in some way important in my mother's life. Just how important was something I was to learn slowly over time. Exactly how Ruth and Hans Werner met, I don't really know, but I imagine the day that the young Ruth went along to one of the social gatherings of the Association of Non-Aryan Christians in Dresden, and found herself at the edge of a crowd of bright young men and women. I see her. Her dark hair is fashionably parted in the middle and sleeked against her head. She's wearing a dress that she has laboured over for days to make it just perfect. She was quite pleased with her appearance when she first came into the room, but the people here are far more sophisticated than she is, and very elegant. Nervously she moves towards a lively group of young people sitting at a table, talking animatedly about the new Chancellor and the sudden departure from Germany of Bertolt Brecht. The table is littered with half-empty wine bottles and half-full ashtrays. A tall young man looks up and notices her, nudges one of his companions, and raises his eyebrows at the pretty newcomer. He rises to his feet, a slightly lopsided smile taking away the formality of his little bow, heels clicking together. "Come, please, join us, Fräulein." He introduces himself as Heinz Westfried, and guides her to the empty chair beside his. "And these are my friends, Rodi," and one of the men nods briefly and carries on his conversation with his neighbour, "and Hans Werner." This studious-looking young man gives her an appraising look through half-closed eyes and a curl of cigarette smoke. He offers her a glass of wine and introduces her to the woman beside him, his cousin, Irene, an artist. It is this same Irene who was to drop a bombshell 60 years later that totally changed the last few years of my mother's life. Ruth plays with her wine-glass, listening to their conversation. They all seem to be university students. The talk is all about plays she hasn't seen, books she hasn't read, and politics she knows little about. These dazzling new acquaintances, she soon realizes, are from wealthy families and have all the confidence that money and higher education confer. She feels in awe of them, small, poor, and immature. She's well aware that she is out of her depths intellectually, but Ruth has a natural intelligence and charisma, a charm that overcomes even a lack of money and a good education. Heinz is clearly smitten with this delightful grey-eyed little woman with her peachy soft complexion. He, she realizes, is giving her all his attention, flirting openly with her. She returns his banter, but her eyes are constantly drawn across the table to the bespectacled law student who was introduced as Hans Werner, her ears constantly tuning in to the lively exchanges taking place between him and his cousin. Concerts, dancing, nice eating places with Hans Werner in Germany before the war, just the two of us, very romantic. I first saw him in the club and knew he was special straight away, clever, snappy. It was love at first sight. He noticed me all right, Only I wasn't one of the rich ones, and I think he knew that, because the others, they were all. One Jewish girl she was, her father had a jeweller's shop, or they had some clothing shops. They were the people who could send their children to good schools, and some were doctors and some dentists. Irene was there, and I was the odd one out. In my mind, I see them getting to know one another, going to open-air concerts at the Zwinger, listening to Mozart and watching dancers in 17th century costume perform against the backdrop of its stunning Baroque architecture beneath the gaze of dozens of grimacing stone gargoyles. They go to operas at the Semperoper in Theaterplatz and late suppers at the Italienische Dorfchen. I see them strolling along the Brühlsche Terrasse embankment, sitting at tables under the trees on balmy evenings with foaming glasses of beer, talking through the night. They take boat trips up the Elbe on brightly painted paddle steamers to the Sächsische Schweiz, Saxon Switzerland, an area of outstanding natural beauty just outside Dresden, for romantic walks among the hills on summer days. Perhaps he takes her to the round Kugelhaus in Grosse Garten for Kaffee und Kuchen, coffee and cakes. Do they visit Circus Sarasani, Dresden's resident circus, famous for its flying trapeze artists? Certainly they dance together. That is what young people do after all, and certainly what the residents of Dresden did in those long-gone days. I'm sure that when they strolled through the Markt, he stopped at one of the many flower sellers' stalls and buy her a rose. That was just the kind of thing he would do. I don't know whether she was sometimes included in his family's parties. At some point she was taken to their house and introduced to his parents, Alexandrina, Alexa, and Otto Kastner, both well-known paediatricians in Dresden. Hans Werner was their only adored son, who worshipped his parents in return. By this time, Ruth must have felt a bit more confident and hopeful in their relationship. How aware was she, I wonder, of the growing power of the fascists and of the growing anxiety of the Jewish community? She was not very interested in politics at that time, although increasingly over the next few years the political situation became too menacing to ignore. Hans Werner's family must have seemed quite formidable to Ruth. Here was a family in which it was encouraged for everyone, men and women alike, to have a profession. Hans Werner's mother, Alexa, had graduated as a professional pianist before her marriage and then trained to become a medical doctor. She was the granddaughter of Dresden's court jeweller, Ellimeyer, who owned the most prestigious jewellers in the Judenhof at 14 Neumarkt, in the very heart of Dresden. Suddenly, this abandoned girl, a mere Haustochter with neither family nor education, found herself socializing with one of Dresden's top families. I've always thought that the fact that this did not faze her says a great deal about her courage and spirit, and the fact that they accepted her into their circle says everything about her natural charm. The Kastner family had already had difficulties with the Nazi authorities. Otto was a well-known specialist in the psychology and sexual problems of children. One of his early academic papers, Körpervolumen und spezifisches Gewicht von Säuglingen, I believe this translates approximately as the physical and specific weight of newborn babies, and published in 1912, is available even today on the internet. Before Ruth knew them, he had already been dismissed from his job as school's physician because of his Jewish blood, but had been reinstated on an honorary basis because of his distinguished record, recipient of the Bavarian Military Service Medal and the Iron Cross during World War I. Because he was excluded from earning a salary, he was forced to run a private clinic from his home at 4 Eliasstrasse, Around the time Ruth got to know them, in 1935, he had been arrested on a trumped-up charge of slandering and offensive behaviour towards a pure-blood German woman. He was acquitted, but was rearrested by the Gestapo on the same charge 2 years later. As a child, I knew none of this. By the time I knew him, Hans Werner was alone in the world with no family, no money, and no career. He lived in one rented room in a house in Golders Green, and worked as an office manager in a garage in Poland Street in London's West End, a job he detested. He spent what money he earned indulging in all the cultural activities of concerts, art galleries and theatre that he had been brought up to enjoy, and in travelling to Italy as often as he could to experience first-hand all the treasures of art, architecture, wine and culinary delights that the country had to offer. What thoughts and memories haunted him as he ate alone each evening in his favourite restaurants, I can only imagine. In all the years I knew him, he never talked once about his family or the past. It was a taboo subject. Whether he ever mentioned any of his family in those long letters in German to my mother, I will never know, but somehow I doubt it. Dr. Lang's surgery in Dresden was held in an apartment next door to the large one in which he lived with his wife and dog. They were a wealthy Jewish couple. This was Ruth's first home and job after leaving Neulanderstrasse. Her duties were to clean their apartment and his surgery. After her protected life as Haustochter to the Klinkovs, where she felt valued and comfortable, she was very unhappy and lonely there. She didn't like Frau Lang and described her as an unpleasant and snobbish woman. Her new friends at the non-Aryan Christian club where she met the Kastners were what made her life at that period bearable. After about a year, she solved the problem of her unhappiness in the only way she knew, by running away. Where to? Who knows where the homeless girl went? Perhaps the Kastners gave her temporary shelter, or perhaps she had already secretly applied for her next job. Hans Werner had encouraged her to answer an advertisement for Haustochter to Herr Rothschild, a millionaire factory owner in Stuttgart, near to Tübingen University, where he was a law student. It would be a good move for you, an opportunity to see another city, and I'd be able to see you sometimes. She got the position, and once more had a live-in job with a little pocket money in exchange for housework. Frau Rothschild was rarely there, as she divided her time between their homes in England, Italy and Switzerland. They had 2 children, but both were at boarding school, the boy in England and the girl in Switzerland. Ruth was living alone in the flat with Herr Rothschild for most of her time there. She was a bit in awe of him, I think, but she told me that she liked him. On one occasion, she asked him if it would be possible to buy some proper toilet paper instead of cutting up newspapers for the lavatory. His answer took her aback, but amused her too, enough for her to remember it many years later. What's good enough for a Rothschild arse is good enough for the arse of little Ruth. While she lived in Rothschild's apartment, she became increasingly aware that the house cleaners, presumably she meant the people who cleaned the shared public areas of the apartment block, were fascists and spies. By this time, things were really becoming difficult for Jews. She became scared because she was often alone in the apartment. Rothschild had many secret meetings in his flat that were all very hush-hush. Everyone spoke in English, so Ruth couldn't understand anything that was going on. Later, she learned that arrangements were being made for Rothschild to disappear. He even made tentative invitations for her to go with them to Italy. She may have been tempted if it hadn't have been for her love for Hans Werner. She wanted to stay near him. But she had another reason for hesitating. She was afraid of becoming too much of a servant, of being too much in the power of these very rich people. She refused his offer. One day, a cleaner from Rothschild's office came and warned her that her boss was opening and reading all her letters when she gave them to him to post. What did he think could have been dangerous in the letters of this poor little Haustochter? No doubt they were simply sisterly letters to her brother, or romantic ones to Hans Werner. I don't think she was in touch with the Klinkovs at all, but these were times of great fear and suspicion, and he could be forgiven for being cautious. He was right to think that her very innocence and vulnerability could be a danger to him. Someone from his office came to her one day and warned her that he was going to do a moonlight. "And you will end up not getting paid what he owes you." To me, this sounds like a malicious person trying to make trouble for Rothschild. How they knew about this plan, which was supposed to be such a secret, Ruth never found out. However, she was very afraid that she'd have no money to get back to Dresden if this happened. If he suddenly disappeared without paying her, what could she do? She would be trapped in Stuttgart. What she did next was something that in later years, when she found out what was being done to the Jews, she felt horribly sick about. She went to the police and told them that her boss wouldn't pay her. She didn't tell them any of his plans. She never mentioned that he was going, but even so, it could have been very bad for him. The consequence of this was that one of his office workers came to the apartment and paid her everything she was owed in wages, saying, with hardly disguised sarcasm, "Herr Rothschild doesn't want to be in debt to you, Fraulein, but he never wants to see you again." She packed her bag and took the next train back to Dresden. Ruth's next job sounded just the thing. She had always wanted to work with children, and the new post she found was as nanny to 3 young children. It all looked so promising. The people were friendly, the house was pleasant, and she was given her own room. Settling down on her first night there, she went to sleep in a positive mood. She was woken up in the middle of the night with an attack of coughing. She was itching all over her body. Turning on the light, she was horrified to see bugs coming out from behind the wallpaper. They crawled up the walls, across the ceiling, and were dropping onto her bed. She examined herself and found that she was covered in bites. Whatever they were sucking her blood. As the bugs seemed to dislike the light, she didn't dare turn off her lamp and lay awake and on watch for the rest of the night. The following morning, she told her new employer that she couldn't stay. The woman must have been puzzled, for Ruth had appeared to be so enthusiastic the previous day. "Didn't you tell her?" I asked. "No, I was young. I was too embarrassed to tell her that her lovely home was infested. So I just left. I went to stay with the Kastners."